So please, as our presenters, our authors are speaking, think about the questions you may have for them. And the authors will actually offer an autographing session just outside, immediately to your right, at a booth after the conclusion of the discussion. So please, if you haven't done so already, just silence your cell phones. Silence your cell phones to minimize any distractions during the discussion. And at this point in time, if you would please join me in giving a very special welcome to Nancy Abudu, a legal director of ACLU of Florida, who's our introducer.
Thank you. And again, I also want to thank you all for being here this morning. It was a special honor for me to be able to introduce these two authors because as a civil rights lawyer, it's always important for us to be able to show and educate the public about the important social issues happening and challenging our society today. And these authors are examples of people who are able to do that through the art of literature. And so while as readers, I'm sure you all have had, or hope you've had an opportunity to become familiar with these authors through the bio, my directions are to stick to the script. And so I'm going to, as quickly as possible, read for you some of their accomplishments. Ben Mezrich graduated magna cum laude from Harvard. He's published 12 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Accidental Billionaires, which was adapted into an Academy Award-winning film, The Social Network, and Bringing Down the House, which has sold more than 1.5 million copies and has been translated into 12 different languages. Once Upon a Time in Russia is the untold true story of the larger-than-life billionaire oligarchs who surfaced the waves of privatization to reap riches after the fall of the Soviet regime. Many have noted that this work was written with the heart-stopping pacing of a thriller, but even more compelling because it is true. Once Upon a Time in Russia is at once personal and political and offers an unprecedented look into the wealth, corruption, and power behind what Graydon Carter has called the story of our age. Our next speaker, Eric, is an actor, playwright, and novelist of Armenian descent. He was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his play Talk Radio and is the recipient of the Berlin Film Festival Silver Bear Award, as well as 3 Obie Awards and a Drama Desk. In addition to his celebrated work in theater and on screen, he has authored 3 novels. One of history's most remarkable acts of vengeance is revealed in Bogosian's latest, Operation Nemesis, the assassination plot that avenged the Armenian genocide, which is both a riveting read and a profound examination of evil, revenge, and the costs of violence. Please help me welcome our authors today. Thank you for being here.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I love coming down to Miami as I live in Boston, so any excuse to come to Miami is always welcome. I was going to tell you a little bit about Once Upon a Time in Russia, which is my newest book, but I want to talk to you about how I got to that book, because I'm not really known for writing serious political books. I, as a child, didn't want to be a journalist. I didn't really think much of nonfiction. It really wasn't what I wanted to do. I actually loved television. Not good TV like you've done, but really bad TV like Saved by the Bell and Three's Company. And my parents, fearing the worst when I was little, made a rule that we had to read 2 books a week before we were allowed to watch TV. So I became a speed reader by the age of 12, and for the wrong reasons, right? But I did become a good reader. And by the time I graduated from college, I knew I wanted to be a writer. So I locked myself in a room in Boston, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And I wrote 9 novels that were deep, dark stories that took place in bars in New York City because I was reading Bret Easton Ellis at exactly the wrong time in my life. And consequently was rejected by everyone in publishing, had 190 rejection slips all over the walls. I looked like a serial killer. Eventually, I was actually rejected by a janitor at a publishing house because I wrote a manuscript and sent it to an editor who was no longer working there, and it got thrown in the trash. It got taken out of the trash by a janitor who read it and then sent me a rejection letter. But I kept going, and eventually I wrote a thriller. It was a medical thriller, none of you read. It was called Threshold, and it sold like 5 copies. And it got me a second book called Reaper, which again, none of you read, which was turned into a horrible TV movie called Fatal Error, which I hope none of you saw. It starred Antonio Sabato Jr., remember the underwear model? And I remember watching it with my dad. Antonio plays a surgeon, and there's a scene where he's leaning over the patient's chest, and he goes, "We've got a subdural hematoma." And my dad turned to me and goes, "You know that's in the head, right?" So anyways, that was what I was writing. I did a little stint with the X-Files. I wrote for the X-Files, and I was that kind of a writer. And then I used to hang out at a bar in Boston, MIT Dive Bar, and there was a group of MIT kids there, and they had tons of money. And it was always in $100 bills. And the thing is, you never see $100 bills. So I followed one of them home, and in his laundry was $250,000 in hundreds. And I thought, he's got to be this drug dealer, right? But he was like a good, geeky kid, and he was Asian. I didn't even know if there were Asian drug dealers. He was this nice MIT kid. He invites me to Vegas with him, and we fly there with 6 of his buddies. And when we land, we get to this suite, and they pull money out from under their clothes, and they piled it on the table, and it was $1 million in cash. And they announced, "We're the MIT blackjack team." And I was blown away. This was a real thing. It had been going on for 25 years, group of student to group of students. They trained each other on how to beat the game of blackjack, and these guys had won $6 million playing blackjack. So that became my first true story. I became a nonfiction writer. That became a movie called 21, and after that, everyone started to pitch me movie or book ideas. I was sitting at home, a random email came into my house. My best friend founded Facebook, and no one's ever heard of him. I had heard of a guy called Mark Zuckerberg, never heard of anybody else. I went out for a drink and walked Eduardo Saverin. And some of you have seen The Social Network. He looked just like the guy in the movie, a lot uglier, but looked like a dog that had been kicked a couple times. He sits down at the table and he says, "Mark Zuckerberg fucked me." Can I say that? He said, "Mark Zuckerberg fucked me," and that was the beginning of this conversation. And he told me the whole story of how they created Facebook. They were 2 geeky kids at Harvard, had trouble with girls. Mark locked himself in a room and created Facebook after a really bad date. Nearly got kicked out of school and caught the attention of the Winklevi twins. You couldn't invent these guys if you wanted to, right? 6'5", identical twin Olympic rowers, who tried to hire Mark to help him out. And Mark didn't think much of their idea, launched Facebook. They sued, Eduardo sued, all this suits happened, and I wrote that book, and that became the movie, The Social Network. Now, throughout this whole process, I knew a guy, a director named Brett Ratner. Some of you have heard of Brett Ratner. He's actually from Miami. He did the Rush Hour movies. He did Tower Heist and Hercules. Every couple of years, he calls me up with a story idea. But it's always incredibly dangerous. Like, it's always gun runners in Miami or drug dealers in Panama. And I say, "Well, Brett, how dangerous is this?" And he's on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like an 8. And I'm like, "Well, I don't want to do an 8. I want to do like a 2 because I'm scared of most things." So about 2 years ago, he calls me up and he says, "I've got a story for you. I want you to come to London." And I said, "Well, what's the story?" And he said, "Well, if I tell you the story, you won't do it." And I was like, "Well, that doesn't sound like a great invitation." But he convinced me to go to London. So I flew to London, and I land there, and I go to this bar, and there's 60 security people standing outside. Guys with guns, with headphones, and all this kind of stuff. And I go into the bar, and sitting at the bar is an oligarch. Now, the oligarchs, some of you may know, were men in Russia who rose to immense wealth after the fall of communism. Most of them came to power during Yeltsin's years, and some of them remained after Putin came to power. At one point in time, 7 oligarchs owned 50% of Russia's GDP. You talk about the 1% in this country, it was 7 people. And so the oligarch that I was talking to proceeded to tell me this insane story about a guy named Boris Berezovsky. Boris Berezovsky, pre the fall of communism, he was Jewish. It was a very anti-Semitic society, so he wasn't allowed to go to regular schools. He wasn't allowed to have regular jobs. He was a mathematician. When everything fell down and the walls fell down and capitalism came, he became a car salesman. He worked his way up to becoming very wealthy selling cars. He then was driving, his driver was driving him out of his office, and his car blew up. He was nearly killed. His driver was decapitated. He was covered in burns. And he made the decision at that moment that the only way to be successful in Russia was to become part of the Kremlin, was to get into politics. So he wormed his way into Yeltsin's Kremlin and became known as the godfather of the Kremlin. Our second main character is Roman Abramovich. He was a 26-year-old toy salesman from Siberia. He made rubber duckies. An orphan, nobody knew much about him. He meets Boris Berezovsky on a boat in the Caribbean, and he pitches him the idea of privatizing an oil company. Together they go to Yeltsin, and they pitch this idea, and Yeltsin hands them an oil company in a rigged auction, which eventually becomes worth $15 billion. Now, Yeltsin starts to get sick. He's dying. You know, we always saw pictures of him drunk. He fell off a bridge once. He was not a healthy man. The oligarchs realized they needed to replace Yeltsin with somebody, and they were looking for someone who was a low-level person, someone who could just do what they said. They called him a cog. And they found a low-level KGB agent in St. Petersburg named Vladimir Putin. They knew him because he had once helped Berezovsky set up a car dealership. They picked him because they thought he'll always do what we say. They placed him in power, and he became president. 2 weeks after he became president, he invited all of the oligarchs to Stalin's old home. This is a place where you can see bullet holes in the walls where people were lined up and shot. And he sat the oligarchs down at a table, and he said, "You've all made a lot of money, you've all done very well, but from here on out, you stay out of my way." And that was the moment that Russia changed. And any oligarch who stayed out of his way is still an oligarch today. The other oligarchs who did not are either dead or in exile. Berezovsky refused to bow down to him and fought him in the press. Berezovsky soon was threatened by Putin. Putin gave an interview to a newspaper and said, "We carry a big stick and we're only going to use it once," and it was aimed at Berezovsky. He fled to London. Abramovich realized that Berezovsky was not a good partner anymore and made a payoff. He handed him $1.3 billion on an airfield in Megève, France, and said, "Now our relationship is finished." Berezovsky took the $1 billion, blew through it all, and then sued Abramovich in the largest lawsuit in the history of the world for $5.6 billion. Lost the lawsuit, and then was found hanging over his bathtub. That's the story. Now, writing the story was terrifying, as you can imagine. There were a lot of meetings with some very frightening people. I remember one meeting I was with Brett Ratner, and we were sitting with one of these oligarchs, and Brett goes, "Are we going to get killed for writing this story?" And he goes, "You watch too many movies." And then Brett says, "Well, what if we say the wrong thing?" And he said, "Well, don't say the wrong thing." So there you have it. This is going to be a movie as well. It's sold to Warner's. Brett's producing it, and we have a very big writer who just signed on, and we have a bunch of very big stars to play the characters, but I can't really go into who they are yet. But it looks like it's going to go into production this year, so that'll be very cool. And that puts me to where we are now. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That was amazing. We've decided we're both going to talk for 10 minutes to just introduce. We're not doing this for you. We're doing it for each other so we can get what it is we're here to talk about today. So I'm going to reset my thing here. I'm going to talk for 10 minutes. I'm Eric Bogosian, and I first came to Miami 31 years ago to do a bit part in a TV show that changed this city, Miami Vice. And that was my introduction to this town. I've been here before. I've been to the book fair before. And thank you very much for coming by today to listen to us chatter on about our work. If you don't know me, and I would imagine that you don't know my whole story, because as an actor, I have a very prominent presence sort of visually in TV shows and whatnot. I did like 60 Law and Orders as the captain on that show. I've done Steven Seagal movies. I've done different things like that. This literary side of me, maybe you may know about it, you may not know about it. The truth is that I started out in the theater. I started acting when I was in high school, and I continued to act through college, and then I basically gave it up. I started hanging around with the visual arts gang in Lower Manhattan. I worked at a place called The Kitchen. I started a dance program there, and they were doing something called performance art in the late 70s and early 80s. I was a trained actor. I didn't know anything really about performance art, but to my eye, it looked like a kind of simple form of theater. And after a while, I started making my own little pieces in that scene, in lofts and so forth. In 1982, Joseph Papp invited me into his office, and I was back in the theater again. He said, "I hear you do these solo shows," which was what I was doing. I was doing pieces that to me seemed to be sort of an investigation of what is acting all about. So I would play a variety of characters in one sort of hour-and-a-half piece. I would do like a dozen different guys, and I would play these different people. It was all about acting. It was about the process of acting. It was about transformation. This is the stuff that I found really fascinating in theater. It never occurred to me that I was writing these things. And a year later, 1983, a William Morris agent came by to a theater where I was performing this stuff after successfully doing a couple of shows with Joe, and he said, "I want to sign you." And I said, "Great, I can't wait to start working. I'm so poor, and I want to work as an actor in movies and TV." He says, "I'm not an acting agent, I'm a writing agent." And I said, "Well, I'm not a writer." And he said, "You wrote this show, you're a writer." And for the next 20 years, I did these solo shows, and those triggered, that opened doors for me to write plays. Joe Papp did 2 shows of mine at the Public, and then after those 2 shows, I went back to him with a 3rd show. These were solos. And he said, "Look, Eric," and this is a long time ago, this is in the 80s. He said, because things aren't like this now in the theater, but at that time he said, "Look, we do plays here, we don't do solos. I made an exception for you because you basically said this was a one-person play in a way, what you were doing, but now everybody wants to do a solo here, and I can't do all these. Dustin Hoffman wants to do a solo, everybody wants to do a solo, and I can't do solos here, so you can't, we're not gonna do it. Sorry, you have to go somewhere else." And so I wandered around town, and I eventually got set up with Wynn Hanman at American Place Theater, and I did a show there called Drinking in America, 1986. The show was an enormous hit, and it was basically sold out for 4 months, and all of a sudden I was making more money than I knew what to do with, and I was also working all the time, and my name was in every paper, and everything was like happening. Joe Papp came by to see the show one night, and he came backstage, and he said, that was great. And I said, "Thanks, Joe." And he said, "Why did you leave us?" I said, "Well, I left you because you threw me out." But so he said, "Listen, you come back to the Public Theater and you can do whatever you want to do, carte blanche." And I said, "Well, I have an idea for a play. I haven't written it yet, called Talk Radio." And he put it in it was in the next year's season without me even writing the play. And on January 1987, we opened Talk Radio at the Public Theater, and my life was changed. We ended up making a movie. I made a movie with Oliver Stone. This introduced me to the world of screenplay writing, and I ended up writing screenplays out in LA for about 15 years, TV shows. I did another play at Lincoln Center called Suburbia. Both of these were made into movies, and everything was very different for me from that point onward. The key thing is that I want to talk about is how I sort of stumbled into the notion that I was a writer. I loved the idea of being a writer, but I didn't really know how to be a writer. So I wrote these monologue things, and that sort of I got up enough of a head of steam that I could write Talk Radio, which is also a very fragmented piece, and then eventually ended up writing Suburbia, which is more typically plotted play, and a number of plays since that time. Eventually, I stopped writing plays simply because I couldn't get them produced. And so I was getting them produced out of town. I wanted them produced in New York, and Joe had passed away, and whatever. I mean, you align yourself with a theater, that's how things get produced. I started writing novels. I wrote 3 novels because the format appealed to me. I'd always been a really big reader. The last time I was here, I was bringing a novel called Perforated Heart. And that was a lot of fun. But what that really did for me was it taught me how to write long form and how to focus. And as I'm taking a lot longer than you did, Ben. Ben, you were so compressed. As a young man, to write in this fragmented, acting, sort of punk rock way was one thing. But as I got older, in my 40s and my 50s, to stay focused on one project for a couple of years and generate pages and do that kind of editing that was needed, all of this was a new way of thinking that it was all new for me. It required discipline, it required focus, and those books were created. Well, during all of this stuff, I'm Armenian, I'm from Armenia. My grandparents all were from Turkey. And I grew up knowing I was Armenian, eating Armenian food, going to Armenian church, which is a Christian church, being around people who speak Armenian, learning about the Armenian genocide in the vaguest sense of the Turks are horrible people and they did this horrible thing to us. well, Armenians would come to my shows very proud of me. Proud, I keep my last name. Bogosian is a typical Armenian name. Very hard. 20 years ago when I was starting out in show business, no one seemed to be able to say Bogosian. It was just an impossible name. I would actually be on talk shows and they would say, today we have Eric. How do you say that name? And that was an issue. Today it seems to be more and more like people getting it, Armenians, etc. Anyway, so why don't you write something about the Armenian experience? Why don't you write something about the genocide? You're writing all the time, write something. About 10 years ago, I became aware of a story about a young man named Soghomon Tetlerian who gunned down Talat Pasha, who was the leader of the Turks during the genocide in 1921 in Berlin. Soghomon Tetlerian claimed that he was an engineering student in Berlin, that he happened to see Talat, who was in exile at the time, walking down the street, and when he went home that night, he had nightmares, and his mother came to him in his dream. His mother had been massacred by the Turks, beheaded actually, and she said, how can you let this man live? He got a hold of a Luger, he followed Talat the next day, shot him with one bullet, and killed him. He was immediately arrested. There was a huge trial, got worldwide publicity, and he was acquitted based on a very simple idea, which was, how can a man who sees his whole family massacred right before his eyes, how can we blame him for shooting the man who he believes is hot? If you were Jewish and you killed Hitler, how could anybody blame you? Well, it's the same kind of situation. So he has this big trial. He's acquitted. He becomes a hero to the Armenian people. I learn about this story, and I think this will make a movie. Perfect movie structure. I hope Ben will back me on this. Act 1, they're in the desert on one of these horrible death caravans. He's seeing his whole family massacred. Act 2, he's in Berlin. He sees Talat on the street. He shoots him. He's arrested. Act 3, the trial. Perfect way to end a movie. End with a trial. He's acquitted. Hooray. End of movie. Great. This is 8 years ago. I'm going to write this movie. It should take me about 3 months to write it. I begin to do research into the movie because I want to know what I'm talking about. And I also don't really know that much about Armenia, Ottoman Empire, any of this stuff. No sooner than I start to do the research than I discover that, in fact, Tetlerian in court is making all this up. He's not a student. He didn't see his family massacred. He didn't just happen across Talat as he was walking down the street. He was a trained assassin sent specifically to Europe to gun down Talat Pasha from Boston, Massachusetts. It was an international conspiracy. They called themselves Operation Nemesis. They sent operatives all over Europe, and they succeeded in assassinating 6 major Turkish leaders responsible for the Armenian genocide. And this is a story I had never heard, and I didn't know if anybody else would ever heard this story. So I started to think this is a book. And I also, because I knew so little about the Armenian genocide and so little about World War I, Russia, Ottoman Empire, that I felt that the book had to be an introduction to all of that, and I had to sort of learn about it myself. Sarah Vowell is one. Oh, see, now I've gone over 10 minutes. I'll wrap this up, and then we can talk to each other. But Sarah Vowell is one of my best friends, and Sarah, if you know her work, is fantastic. We have applause for Sarah Vowell. She writes popular histories about American history, and they're done very much from her point of view and with a kind of a vein of humor through all of it. So I thought, well, that's what I'll do. I'll just learn everything about this subject, and I'll just kind of talk about it, and the reader will have an easy way of floating through this. I'll make it easy for them. But unfortunately, genocide and the complexity of this story does not lend itself to humor, and I found myself in very different ground. And 7 years later, research all around the world, did not plan to do primary research. I was just going to read everything that had already been written about this stuff. But what happens when you write history is you very quickly find yourself on the frontier of that history. You find yourself at the very point where people aren't exactly sure what happened. And you're sitting there saying, I want to know what happened. And now I can go into the British archives, or I can go here. I know the letter I'm trying to find. I know the thing I'm trying to find. And I found some of these things. I found complicity by British intelligence with this assassination plot. I found out, now some of this stuff is secret. In fact, the children of the children are around of this conspiracy, and they weren't so sure they wanted me digging up some of this stuff. Don't forget, it was basically, in 1921, it was Murder Incorporated, and it wasn't exactly something that you could talk about with people. And as the years went by, the thing became encrusted with myth, and then it was sort of secret, but it wasn't secret. They wanted to tell people about it. And I had this whole mishmash that I had to sort of paw through as I tried to learn what actually happened. So what actually happened was men who were they were pretty much nobodies, a CPA in Albany, a insurance salesman in Hartford, Connecticut, a small-time editor in Boston, Mass. These are men of Armenian who had grown up, born in Turkey. After the genocide, they said, we have to do something. And they pulled together this group of ex-veterans and other men who were comfortable handling guns, and they raised money through charitable contributions, and they put together this group, and they sent them all over Europe, and they tracked down these guys, and for 2 years they were killing people. They killed over 10 people, because they killed bodyguards, they killed other people as well. And then they were told to disband, and they disappeared. So these men came from nowhere, and they ended up anonymous. Most of them were either not caught, or in the case of Tetlerian, acquitted. Only one man was caught because he killed a leader. He killed Jamal Pasha in Tbilisi, which at the time was communist, and operatives from Cheka grabbed him, and he was sent to Siberia and never heard from again. So that's the story in a nutshell of Operation Nemesis. And like I said, because I didn't know anything about Ottoman Empire, Armenia, World War I, I had to sort of digest all of that and stick that in there too, so that you could understand what is the context of this, political parties, assassination, etc. One thing I just want to leave you with that I think is very important to all of this, and why I want you to read my book, is that when World War I gets talked about, at least through most of my lifetime, it is always focused on what was happening between Germany and France for the most part, the trench warfare and dogfights and so forth. But there was a whole other war, which you know about sort of from Lawrence of Arabia, that was happening in the Middle East. And that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. Basically, the Ottoman Empire ended at the end of World War I. And a new leader came in, Kemal Ataturk, and it became the Republic of Turkey. Looking at the news today, and in fact, the news going all the way back to what was happening in Bosnia and Serbia in the 1990s, this is all about the end of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was around for 600 years, and its dissolution and the discovery of oil in the Middle East is everything about what is happening there today. So that is a very important tangential part of this story. And I swear, if you read this book and you start to become familiar with the Ottoman Empire as I did, you then look at the news and you see what's happening over there today, and you see it in a whole different light. What is Syria? Syria is the French possessions. What is Iraq? Iraq's a made-up place. That, by the way, Iraq is founded the day after Talat is assassinated. He's assassinated March 15th. Iraq is founded on March 16th, 1921. Interesting stuff. Also, historically, I don't know of any other stories like this. You know, a group of nobodies, civilians, not secret agents, decide that they need to do something, and they do it, and then they disappear, and they got it done. They basically came out of nowhere, changed world history, and went back to being people nobody ever heard of. So that's my book, and we're going to talk to each other now, even though I talked for way too long, and ask each other a question.
That was awesome. You could keep going if you want. I love it. But I have to ask right off the bat, is it going to, I mean, are you thinking movie as well? Because it is an incredible movie.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the fun parts of this thing that we both ended up at these chairs today at the same day, is that, first of all, we were both curious about topics and they led us into things. But the other thing is the idea of adaptation of stuff that's historically exists, right, and then it becomes a movie. And in my case, people would say, oh, that's a movie, that's a movie. And it's like, well, first of all, I live in a fictional world most of the time, so if I want to make up another part of my story, I just make it up. Right. And I was working on this book, and I would like start to make, and I'm working with editors, layers and layers of editors, and they go, when did this guy say that? And I said, Well, I don't know. He probably said it. They said, no, you can't. You can't do that. You have to. We need a source. When did he say it? What day? Who are you getting this from? So the idea of a movie was like, oh, action. It's an action movie. It's assassination. All this stuff. It's like, I don't know how to write action. A long time ago, I started to understand what I know how to write, what I don't know how to write. I write from characters and conflict, and that's how my story gets told. And I wasn't sure where the story was. And at the very end of working on the book, a colleague brought me secret letters between these guys in code. They told me what they said. They were in Armenian. And I began to understand that these guys really were from nothing. Right. And that's where I thought there might be a movie. Whether there is a movie, I think, all of us, I know you're a movie guy, but it's all happening on TV right now, like miniseries and things. And I do feel that now that the factual story is out there, that I could tell the story and take some license. Right. I guess we're allowed to do that, right? Yeah. How much do you fudge stuff?
Well, depends whether you ask me or Janet Maslin. But I would say that for the most part, I do all the research, I get all the information, I know everything that happened, and then when I sit down to write it, I write it like a thriller. So all of it is true, but it's written in a dramatic way. So for instance, dialogue, I'm not going to know exactly what was said 25 years ago or whenever this happened. So I've interviewed the people, and I have all of these court documents, and then I create the dialogue based on that. So I think all of the scenes are real and true, but certainly the dialogue will be composite from certain things that I know was said during the conversations, and and the chronologies, fit as much as I can fit them. But I will say there is a little bit of wiggle room even in nonfiction. Nobody writes, an encyclopedia. People write a book with themselves in it, and to some extent, you have to put drama in because the drama is there, but you pick and choose which moments to tell, and by picking and choosing those moments, you're crafting it. So yeah.
Would you change a timeline?
It's a good question. Not purposefully, no. There are different times when I've been writing books where nobody's really clear on what the timeline was. And then you're making a best guess. Certain things happened. Because most of my books aren't historical. A group of MIT kids went to Vegas. You're interviewing people who ran for 5 years back and forth to Vegas. They're not necessarily always going to remember where things happened. So in that respect, yeah. But in terms of the Russia book, for instance, tons of documentation. No, I wouldn't change anything in that. It was exactly how it happened. But on the other hand, I have scenes between Putin and people, and obviously I didn't interview Putin. So in those scenes, you're making a best guess as to what happened in that room.
Yeah, I had a kind of an aha moment with 10 minutes? 10 minutes till Q&A, or 10 minutes till we explode? So we should start the Q&A now.
Well, let's go for it.
Okay. Well, let me just finish my thought, because I know that everybody here is just hanging on my every word. I just want to say that there had been some coverage of my topic in the past, but nobody had bothered to lay one timeline on top of another timeline. And I basically took one timeline, which was this British agent and his travels and where he was and who he talked to, and then I laid it on top of the assassination and how it was happening. And sure enough, there he is meeting with Talat 2 weeks before Talat is knocked off. And Talat is saying, if you don't work with us, i.e. the new Turks, we will start a revolution against all Islamic revolution against you in India, in the Suez and so forth with the British. And another colleague of mine who knew I was interested in this topic found a cable in Minnesota where American agents and British agents are talking about how much it would cost to kill Enver Pasha. This is also contemporary. So I knew they were in the business of knocking off leaders, and then I had a timeline, so for what that's worth. Okay, so Q&A. Let's do it.
And I'm the assigned moderator, so if you do have a question, please step forward to either one of the two microphones, and then just let us know if you're addressing your question to either Eric or Ben.
This question is addressed to both of you. Have your books been banned in Russia and in Turkey?
So it's an interesting question. So my book is coming out in about 9 or 10 different countries. We did get a call about a month ago from a Russian publisher who wants to publish it, and we said, go for it. So we'll see what happens. In the scope of the book, it's not actually an anti-Putin book. It's not an opposition book. In this story, Putin chases the oligarchs out of Russia. And at that time period, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. These oligarchs were essentially raping Russia, taking all the resources away and becoming multi-billionaires, and Putin was the strong man who would save Russia for Russia. Eventually, he became the biggest oligarch of all, but in the scope of this story, I don't think Putin will dislike it. But we'll see what happens when the Russian publisher publishes it, and whether that leads to the end of that Russian publisher or not.
I've gotten an offer from Turkey, which we are negotiating right now. For those of you who are familiar with Armenians in Turkey and genocide, there's a misunderstanding that it is forbidden to talk about the genocide in Turkey today, and it isn't. They are talking about the genocide in Turkey. The government of Turkey will not acknowledge the genocide, but they're doing a very different tact now. They're not denying it. They are doing what the tobacco companies did and what the global warming they say that there's a debate, and they spend a lot of money on this notion of a debate, and because I have people parrot this to me all the time, I know that people have taken this in and incorporated into the thinking about that there's some sort of debate about whether there was an Armenian genocide or not. So they don't care if my book gets published. They want a book out that says that Armenians were shooting Turks. That's their idea of something good. So actually it was Armenians who were having the biggest problem, and they finally, once the book was out, I was endorsed by all the different Armenian political groups and whatnot who were associated with these actions.
Great, thank you. Next question from this side, please.
Regarding Russia, a lot of us had high hopes for what might happen there after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we know what happened instead. And I'm wondering, after writing this book, if you see any reason for hope now.
Well, I mean, yes. Oh, yes and no. I have a mixture of feelings. So what happened, essentially, is communism fell, and they attempted to force capitalism overnight. They essentially, Yeltsin and his crew did not know how to do capitalism. They ended up handing off the resources to anybody who was a businessman who basically had a connection to the Kremlin. They became these cowboys. Thousands of businessmen were murdered, and the Russian people were screwed. The reality is the Russian people have almost always been screwed. They were screwed under the czars, they were screwed under communism, they were screwed under capitalism, and now under Putin. Putin is very popular, he's very powerful. I think that there could be a good future in that I think his goal is to be known as powerful and as a first world nation. He doesn't want the country to be looked at by the rest of the world as, an oligarchy necessarily. He wants it to be seen as a first world nation. So I do think that there is a possibility of it. The oligarchs for the most part either work for Putin, they're known as his cash registers, or they just get out with their money. And Russia is so tied to oil too that it's kind of a disastrous economy in a way. When oil goes down, Russia goes down and they start wars. When oil goes up, Russia is rich and they start wars. So I mean, I think it's a tough question, but I will say that the fall of communism was not, didn't work out great at first. That's definitely true. But it's still only been a short period of time. We're talking the 90s. This isn't 100 years ago. This is 20 years ago. So 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. So you have to give it a little more time, I think.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question from this side, please. We have 5 more minutes, so if someone else wants to ask a question from either side, please get in line.
This is for Mezrich.
Sure.
Have the oligarchs taken any major position in the corporation of the United States? Do they have control over any industries?
Well, I mean, one of them owns the New Jersey Nets, right? One of them's big at Warner's Music. There's oligarchs all over. I think most of the real estate in New York and Miami is going to Russian oligarchs now. Russian oligarchs move their money out of Russia because they want to put it into stable places. So yes, you do have a lot of Russian money in a lot of corporations here, as much as they can, and the ones that stay under the radar definitely. But real estate is a perfect example. I mean, in London, for instance, they're buying $100 million homes all over the place, and the same goes on in Miami and New York. Yeah, a lot of American corporations have a lot of Russian money into it. And they buying up, there's an internet company, there's one of them, I forget which guy, who has invested in almost all of the internet companies. Many Hollywood movies are made by Russians with Russian money. That's yeah. Listen, Hollywood will take money from anybody, and so will a lot of industries.
Thank you. Yes, next and last question, please.
For both of you, but I guess particularly
Ben.
in regards to the oligarchs
Oh,
and
yeah.
Putin. Very dark histories in both cases. Murderers, thieves. In your research, did you find characters that had some principles, had some sense of morality?
Right.
Or were they all just murderers and thieves?
That's a great question. So I remember interviewing one of them, and I was saying, well, so when your company was competing with another company and they were doing stuff you didn't like, you would send people over to kill them. And I'm like, well, how, in America, we don't do that. And he said, well, you're comparing 1990s America and 1990s Russia. You need to compare 1890s America and 1990s. In the 1890s, you would send your gunslingers over to shoot the other guy. In Russia, if every company, the aluminum company, would have a division of people whose job it was security, was wet works. And if something happened, they would go over and bash up the other team. And that's how business worked in the 90s. And they said that's the world we were in. You have to remember, nobody was innocent. Nobody was running an aluminum company and going, oh my God, they're killing people. They knew they were killing people. So nobody in it was an innocent person. And I think if you look at the trial that went on and you can read the depositions, they're basically very matter of fact about it. And this is how it worked at the time. And now it's getting much better.
I'll just say that standing behind my whole book is a moral question of when you know you're right, what about shooting these people? If you know, they had been all convicted in Turkish courts at the end of the war of war crimes, capital war crimes, in absentia, and all of the people who were gunned down were convicted and sentenced to death. So the Armenian Avengers believe that they were simply meting out the punishment that had already come from the courts, because these guys had all run away, they'd all left. The question is still, are you allowed to do that? And I had to ponder this the whole time I was working on the book, and I came to the conclusion that there is the rule of law, which of course you must respect if you expect governments to follow the rule of law. If you claim genocide, then that also involves law, right? So law has to be consistent, otherwise it's not law. Then there's the rule of God, which we become familiar with as children, and some people live their whole lives by it, the 10 Commandments and all of that. But I do think that there's a human law that exists somewhere between heaven and earth that just, sometimes you're just pushed into a corner and you have to act based on what you know is right, and you can't follow any rules or laws that have been passed to you. And that was what motivated these men to do this. These were, in other words, existential acts. Everyone they knew had been killed, their families, their friends. There were no more Armenians in Turkey, and they had to do something. They felt they did. And I don't know what I would have done, but I report and pass the story on to you. So that's it.
Well, we're running perfectly on time. Let me begin to close by saying that, again, autographs will be available immediately outside of the hallway. Take a right. You'll see the gentleman at a booth just around the corner. I want to thank you all again for attending, and please, our authors, thank you so much for the discussion. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.